They say the past never truly dies. It waits in silence, just beneath your skin, until the day it decides to breathe again. For me, it came back with the smell of pine and old books, when a child at the Sunday market asked why I never smiled like the other grandmas. I didn't know how to tell her that some smiles were buried long ago, in a house where the curtains never moved and silence was the only sound. My name is Eloise Norman. I'm 83 years old, and I live in Arrow Rock, Missouri, a quiet, historic town that still clings to the rhythm of horseshoes on brick and hymns from open windows. Most folks around here know me as Grandma Ellie, the old lady with snow-white curls who sells cinnamon bread and apple butter at the Sunday farmers market. They say I have gentle hands and kind eyes, and maybe that's true now, but they don't know what these hands have endured or what these eyes have seen. I spend my days baking, tending my little herb garden, and watching birds from the porch swing, but the nights they belong to someone else, to a version of me that once lay awake in a dark attic, afraid to breathe too loudly. I have spent most of my life trying to scrub that girl from my memory, yet, lately, I've come to believe that telling her story might finally let us both sleep. I never thought I'd speak about what happened, not after so many years of burying it with pleasantries and pies. But there comes a time in every woman's life when silence begins to rot the soul. So I'm speaking now, not for pity, and certainly not for attention. I'm speaking because someone out there needs to hear it, someone who thinks they're alone, and maybe, just maybe, if I tell you how I survived, you'll start to believe that you can too. I was born in the spring of 1942 in a modest wooden house on the outskirts of Arrow Rock, Missouri. Back then, the town felt like the whole world to me, a patchwork of dirt roads, creaking porches, and the scent of lilacs that bloomed along the white picket fences. Life was simple, and for a brief moment in time, it was good. My mother, Helen, was a quiet woman with hands always in motion, folding laundry, kneading dough, brushing my hair before church. She had a voice as soft as a lullaby and eyes that rarely showed rest. My father, Walter, was the kind of man people nodded to in town with respect. He worked at the local sawmill and came home every day with sawdust in his hair and a tired smile that lit up the whole house. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and for a child, that was everything. I remember waking to the smell of bacon and wood smoke, the sound of the screen door slamming as Daddy fetched the morning paper. My younger sister, June, and I would chase fireflies in the yard until our bare feet turned brown with dust. Our days were filled with chores and school, but there was laughter in the walls, songs in the kitchen, and stories by the hearth at night, and then everything changed. It was a rainy October morning when the sheriff came to the door. I was just 6 years old, sitting at the kitchen table, coloring with a box of dull crayons. My mother opened the door, her apron still damp with biscuit flour. She didn't scream when she heard the news. She just collapsed, like a candle blown out. My father had been killed in an accident at the mill. A beam had snapped loose, and he never had a chance. From that moment on, the light in our home dimmed. June was too young to understand, but I watched our mother unravel in slow, silent grief. She cried when she thought we were asleep. The garden grew wild. The bread didn't rise anymore, and the music left our house. She did her best, but she was alone, and it showed. Not long after the funeral, my grandfather, Charles Norman, moved in with us. He was my father's father, a retired pastor who once led a church 3 counties over. People in town whispered about what a God-fearing man he was. They said he had wisdom beyond his years, a voice that could calm a storm. I remember his first day in our house, tall and stiff in his black coat, white hair neatly combed, Bible tucked under one arm. He kissed my mother's hand and called her daughter in that low, polished voice that made the hair on my arms stand. He took up residence in the spare room upstairs and quickly became the man of the house. He said grace at every meal, read us scripture each night, and corrected us with a stern hand when we misbehaved. At first, I tried to love him. I tried to see him the way my mother seemed to like a blessing in our time of loss. He brought order back to our home. He fixed the leaky roof, built new shelves, and even taught me how to read from his old leather Bible. But the warmth in our house never returned. It was replaced by silence. Heavy, watching silence. He rarely smiled. His presence was like the ticking of a grandfather clock, always there, always counting down. He would touch my head when I walked by, sometimes lingering a moment too long. At night, he sat in his room alone, the door always closed. Once, I passed by and saw the flicker of candlelight beneath the crack, heard low murmurs, not prayer, not song, just whispers. He told me I was his favorite. At first, I beamed with pride. I wanted to be special to someone again. But then he began pulling me aside. He'd say things like, God has chosen you for a greater purpose. Or, you are not like other little girls. Eloise, you're meant to be pure in a world full of rot. At 8, I didn't understand the weight of those words, but I started feeling sick in my stomach whenever he was near. Mother was slipping further into herself by then. She took on extra sewing jobs, stayed up late, hunched over fabric and thread, trying to hold the household together. June clung to me more. We were each other's only softness. When I had nightmares, I'd sneak into her bed and whisper stories about a prince who saved us both, but no prince ever came. I remember the first time I truly feared him. I was 9, and we were home alone. He asked me to help him clean the church pew he kept in the shed behind the house, a relic from his preaching days. I followed him without question, still young enough to believe adults meant well. Inside that dark shed, with dust dancing in the slanting light, he placed a hand on my shoulder and whispered something that made my breath catch. Something I didn't understand, but knew was wrong. I ran. I didn't look back. After that day, I avoided being alone with him, but the house was small, and he was always watching, always kind in front of Mother, always composed at church. He'd place his hand on my back during Sunday hymns and say with a smile, "This one has the soul of an angel." People would nod in admiration. I would feel the bile rise in my throat, and so my childhood split in two. The world outside saw a sweet girl raised in faith and structure. But behind our doors, I was learning to hold my breath, to walk silently, to disappear in plain sight. I had no words for what I was feeling. No one ever spoke of such things in Arrow Rock. Girls were told to be obedient, to honor their elders. I thought maybe I was imagining things. Maybe I was the one with darkness inside. I blamed myself for the way his eyes lingered, the way he tightened his grip when no one was looking. By the time I turned 10, I had mastered the art of pretending. I smiled in photographs. I sang hymns with a steady voice. But at night, when the house creaked and the wind pushed against the window pane, I would lie awake, clutching a cracked porcelain doll and begging God to make me invisible. It would be years before I found the strength to speak. But those early years, the lies, the silence, The confusion, they laid the foundation for a storm I could no longer outrun. And though I did not know it yet, the worst was still to come. Of all the memories that blur together from those years, the one that stands out with painful clarity is the day I turned 11. It was early spring. The snow had melted, leaving the earth damp and rich. Mother had taken June into town for shoes, and I stayed behind, hoping for a rare day of peace and quiet. I remember standing barefoot on the back porch, my arms stretched wide like I could catch the breeze and hold it in my chest forever. I was humming something soft and wordless when I heard his voice behind me. "Come with me, Eloise," he said. I turned. He was holding his Bible, the old one with the cracked leather spine. His voice was gentle, and that made it worse. It was always worse when he sounded kind. He led me into the parlor, where the curtains were drawn closed and the dust hung thick in the air. He said we were going to have a lesson. That's what he called them, lessons, just him and me. He made me kneel by the sofa and recite scripture while he read aloud, his voice slow and careful. I was used to this by now, the odd rituals, the sermons that didn't sound quite like the ones I heard in church. But that day, something shifted. He began to speak of sin, not as something external, but something he said was in me. I didn't understand. I tried to say I was sorry, but he wouldn't let me speak. His hand pressed down on my shoulder, hard. I could smell the tobacco on his breath, the dry scent of mothballs on his suit. I froze, the words dying in my throat. And then the lesson turned into something else. I won't describe every moment. I don't need to. Some things are too dark to put into words, but I remember the feeling of being cracked open, of something being stolen from me that I didn't even know could be taken. Afterward, he told me I must never speak of it, that no one would believe me, that if I did, God would punish not him, but me, and worse. He said it would break my mother's heart, that she was already too fragile, that my silence was a gift of protection. And so, I was silent. I walked around like a ghost after that. I washed dishes. I read bedtime stories to June. I attended Sunday service and curtsied politely when adults greeted me, but inside, I was sinking. My skin no longer felt like mine. My voice seemed to belong to someone else. I stopped looking in mirrors because all I saw was shame. And the worst part, I started to believe him. I began to think that maybe I was to blame. Maybe I had invited it by being too proud, too curious, too full of life. Maybe my very presence was a temptation. He planted that rot inside me and watered it with every sideways glance, every whispered blessing. He didn't stop after that first time. Whenever he could catch me alone, he found a reason to punish me, to pray over me, to correct me. The rituals varied. Sometimes it was physical, sometimes it was spiritual, but it always left me feeling like I was unraveling. There was one moment that still makes me shiver. I had fallen asleep in the rocking chair on the porch after chores. I woke to the sound of his footsteps and opened my eyes just enough to see him watching me, his expression unreadable. I stayed perfectly still, pretending to sleep, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it would give me away. He leaned down and whispered, "Even in sleep, you are marked." I didn't know what he meant, and I didn't want to. By the time I turned 12, I had built an armor of silence around me. I spoke only when spoken to. I rarely laughed. I became careful with my body, how I sat, how I walked, how I breathed, because I thought any wrong move might trigger another lesson. And all the while, My mother remained blind. She saw the bruises but explained them away as clumsiness. She heard me cry in the night but chalked it up to bad dreams. I wanted to scream the truth at her, but something in her eyes told me she couldn't hold it, not on top of everything else. So I stayed silent, afraid of destroying the only fragile piece we had left. Then came the day I found my sister hiding in the barn, crying. She was only 8 then. She looked up at me with eyes red and terrified, her hands clutching her doll so tightly the fabric tore. I sat beside her and tried to comfort her, brushing the straw from her hair, but she wouldn't say what was wrong. That night, as we lay in bed together under the same thin quilt, she whispered, "Grandpa scares me." I froze. Every muscle in my body went rigid. "What did he do?" I asked. She shook her head. "He just watches me. When Mama isn't home, he tells me not to tell." My blood ran cold. I pulled her closer. My little sister, whose laughter had once lit up the whole house, and I realized what had to be done. It wasn't about me anymore. If he had turned his attention to her, I couldn't stay quiet. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I walked to the far edge of town, to the house of a woman named Clara Middleton. She was a widow who rarely spoke to anyone, but had once taken care of my mother when she had pneumonia years ago. I remembered that she had kind eyes and that she never once looked at my grandfather with admiration. I told her everything. At first, the words came out in a rush, tangled and stammering, but once they started, they didn't stop. I cried. I shook. I expected disbelief. But when I finished, Clara didn't question me. She placed a blanket over my shoulders and said quietly, "I believe you." She called the sheriff that same afternoon. The investigation was quiet but thorough. When they searched my grandfather's room, they found journals, detailed entries, distorted scripture passages, a disturbing record of control and delusion. The town didn't believe it at first. How could they? Pastor Charles Norman had baptized half of them, but facts have a way of forcing truth into even the most unwilling hearts. He was declared unfit to stand trial due to mental instability and was committed to a sanitarium upstate. He never returned. My mother broke when she learned the truth. She wept for days, not just out of grief, but guilt. She couldn't forgive herself, and for a long time, neither could I. But in the end, it wasn't about her. It was about survival. Mine, June's. And slowly, the sun began to rise again on the edge of our little world. It wasn't warm right away. It didn't chase away every shadow, but it came, quietly and steadily, like dawn always does. And I, Eloise Norman, the girl who was once afraid of her own voice, had spoken. And in doing so, I had changed the story. I hadn't stopped the storm, but I had survived it. And that, I would come to learn, was enough. It's strange how a house can turn into a cage without anyone noticing. After the sheriff took my grandfather away, and the dust from the investigation finally settled, you might expect peace to return to our home, but silence remained a different kind of silence than before. This one wasn't heavy with secrets, but with shame, with confusion, with broken pieces no one dared pick up. My mother barely spoke for weeks. She moved through the house like a ghost, pausing only to light candles or fold the same laundry 3 times over. I would find her in the pantry, staring at a shelf, forgetting what she came in for. Her eyes looked through me instead of at me. I knew she was battling her own war, inside a war between what she wanted to believe and what she had to accept. And then one night, she simply said, "We're leaving Arrow Rock." I stared at her, confused. Where would we go to your Aunt Rose's in Kansas City? Just for a while, she said, though her voice held no certainty. We packed quickly. There wasn't much to take, just a few dresses, some books, a patchwork quilt June insisted on, and my sketch pad, which I had hidden in a loose floorboard beneath my bed. The house felt cold as we shut the door behind us, not just from the early winter, but from the grief that had soaked into its walls. Kansas City was a different world, loud, busy, anonymous. We stayed in Aunt Rose's upstairs apartment, above the bakery where she worked. The scent of yeast and cinnamon filled every room, a strange comfort after years of musty hymnals and damp wood. Aunt Rose was not soft like my mother. She was sharp and loud and laughed with her whole chest. She didn't ask many questions, which I appreciated. Instead, she handed me a school schedule, told me to wear clean socks, and expected me to show up to dinner on time. It was rigid, but safe, and yet the bruises didn't vanish. Not the ones on my skin, they had faded, but the ones buried under my ribs. The ones that flinched when someone walked behind me too quickly. The ones that made me stop breathing when I heard the word grandfather spoken by someone else. At school. I kept to myself. I sat in the back row. I said the right answers, but never raised my hand. I didn't trust boys who smiled too quickly, or teachers who touched your shoulder when they praised you. I drew in my sketch pad during lunch trees with hollow trunks, houses with no windows, birds flying in jagged lines. But there was one teacher who noticed me. Her name was Mrs. Corwin, and she taught literature. She had silver curls and wore brooches shaped like stars. One day, after class, she stopped me. "You draw," she said, looking at the edge of my sketch pad, peeking from my satchel. I nodded, stiffly. "You write, 'No, not yet,'" she said, and smiled. The next week, she handed me a journal with a green fabric cover. "Just write anything," she said. "It doesn't have to make sense." So I did. I didn't write about the abuse, not directly, but I wrote about a girl made of glass who lived in a house with no doors, about a wolf who wore a preacher's robes, about a sister who lit candles to keep the shadows away. The stories poured out like water through a cracked dam, quiet and messy and raw. It became my salvation, but healing is never linear. That spring, I turned 13, and with it came the body I had dreaded. My hips widened, my chest grew. I hated every change. I wore baggy sweaters in the heat and slouched in photos. My reflection felt like a threat. Something about that age, about growing into a young woman, brought back everything I wanted to forget. I began to wake in the middle of the night, sweating, screaming, convinced I smelled his cologne again. I'd curl into a ball in the corner of my room until morning. Aunt Rose found me once and didn't ask questions. Instead, she wrapped me in a blanket and made me peppermint tea. But the worst part was how the world treated me. Men on the street started noticing me in ways that made my stomach churn. Boys in school whispered crude things. One even tried to grab my hand during gym class. I slapped him. Hard. I was sent to the principal's office for inappropriate aggression. I didn't explain myself. What was the point that night? I wrote a story about a girl who turned to stone so no one could ever touch her again. It wasn't just people that haunted me. It was the church. One Sunday, my mother took us to a local congregation. I hadn't stepped into a chapel since the day they took him away. The minute I saw the pulpit, my legs locked, my throat dried. I heard the creak of old wood under black leather shoes. I turned and walked straight out. I sat on the curb until the service was over. My mother didn't mention it. Maybe she understood. Maybe she didn't want to admit how much the past still lived in us. Years went by. Slowly, the days stopped feeling dangerous. I joined the art club. I got a part-time job at the library shelving books. I made a friend, a girl named Lillian, who liked poetry and didn't ask too many questions. I still flinched at loud noises and hated being touched unexpectedly. But I laughed sometimes. I smiled more. And then one day, it happened. I was walking home from the bus stop when a man stepped out of a parked truck and called my name. Eloise. I turned. My blood turned to ice. It was him. Older, thinner, eyes sunken, but unmistakably him. Charles Norman. He wasn't supposed to be out. They said he was in a sanitarium. They said he wouldn't remember, but he did. He smiled. I just wanted to see you. I backed away. I didn't speak. I turned and ran. I didn't tell anyone. Not for days. Not until I saw him again sitting outside the grocery store, reading a newspaper. That's when I broke. I told Aunt Rose. She called the police. They contacted the hospital and confirmed he had escaped. He was picked up within 48 hours and returned to the institution. This time, I wasn't scared. I was furious. Furious that the world had made space for him again. Furious that after all I had done to survive, he still had breath and movement and the freedom to step on the same sidewalk as me. But that moment also marked something new. Power. I had named the fear, and in doing so, I had stripped it of its teeth. After that, I started therapy, real therapy, with a woman named Joyce, who let me talk about the hard things. We talked about guilt, shame, anger, about how trauma isn't something you get over, but something you live with, like a scar you learn to carry. And slowly, I grew. By the time I was 18, I had a scholarship to an art college. I moved out, started fresh. I never returned to Arrow Rock, not for years, not until I was ready. And even then, I didn't return as the girl who had fled. I came back as a woman who had survived. But survival isn't the end of the story. It's only the beginning of a new one. And I was ready to write mine, in ink, in truth, in voice. I was 26 the first time I told my story out loud, not in pieces, not in metaphor, but in truth. It was in a small support group that met once a week in the back room of a women's shelter in Kansas City. The building smelled faintly of mildew and lavender, and the folding chairs creaked beneath us as if groaning under the weight of unspoken things. I had been going for months, sitting silently as other women, some older, some barely out of high school, shared their stories that echoed mine, stories that shattered me. And then one evening, as the room fell into that painful hush between testimonies, I heard my own voice speak. I didn't plan it. It just happened. My name is Eloise Norman, I said, my throat tight, my fingers gripping the hem of my sweater, and when I was a little girl, my grandfather hurt me. Over and over, he said God wanted him to. No one gasped. No one turned away. One woman across the circle, with silver streaks in her braid, just gave a slow nod. And that was all I needed. That night, when I walked home beneath the city's flickering street lamps, I felt both heavy and light, like I had poured out something thick and ancient that had lived inside me for too long. My knees trembled, my shoulders shook, but my soul, for the first time in years, was still. That was the night my healing truly began. I began writing more intentionally, not just in journals, but in essays, stories, poetry. I submitted a piece to a small feminist magazine run out of a bookstore downtown. It was published under a pseudonym, Nora Ellis, a rearrangement of my own name. The essay was titled "The Sound of Footsteps on Old Floorboards." It was raw and trembling, but it resonated. Letters began to arrive, women thanking me for saying what they had never dared to say. Some simply wrote, "Me too." That phrase, 2 words, held more power than I ever could have imagined. With each passing year, I became braver. I joined community efforts to educate survivors. I started volunteering at the same shelter where I once sat in silence. I trained as a crisis counselor, then began speaking at local churches and schools. Yes, even churches, because the truth needed to live there too. But it wasn't always easy. There were people who didn't believe me, some who questioned my motives. One woman from my old church in Arrow Rock sent me a letter saying I was spreading lies about a good man long gone. I held that letter in my hands for a long time before tearing it in half, not out of anger but liberation. Her disbelief couldn't touch me anymore. Still, I avoided my hometown. Arrow Rock had become a museum of memories I didn't want to visit, but life has a way of testing your strength when you least expect it. When June called, I hadn't spoken to her in over a year. She had married young, moved south, and made a life of her own, one we rarely talked about. Our childhood had bound us together, but the pain also built walls. Yet her voice on the phone that day was trembling. Mom passed. She said, "Yesterday." I didn't know what to say. My heart ached not just for the woman my mother had been, but for the one she never became. A mother who couldn't bear the weight of truth, who loved us in silence because the words had betrayed her. We buried her 3 days later, in the same small cemetery where my father rested. I stood beside June as they lowered the casket, a soft drizzle soaking the hem of my black skirt. After the service, June and I sat on the back porch of the old house, the same wooden planks, though now weathered and gray. The house had sat mostly empty for years, rented out to travelers during the tourist season. "Do you remember that summer?" June asked. "The year you used to sing to me at night?" I nodded. "You used to ask for the same song, over and over." She smiled faintly. I didn't know why then, but I do now. Her words hung between us like fragile glass. "I'm sorry I didn't protect you," she whispered. "You were just a child, too." I said. We sat in silence, the cicadas singing in the distance, the past pulsing around us. And in that moment, I felt something shift, a bridge, long broken, finally beginning to rebuild. That night, back at my motel, I pulled out an old notebook, one I hadn't opened in years. On the first page was a drawing I'd made when I was 13, a house with open windows, a girl sitting on the roof, her hair made of flames. I smiled. I finally understood her. In the years that followed, I turned my pain into purpose. I began teaching art therapy at a nonprofit for trauma survivors. I started a program called Voices on Paper, a weekly writing circle for women and girls who had lived through abuse but never had the words. One of my proudest moments was watching a 17-year-old girl named Camilla, who hadn't spoken a full sentence in a year, read her first poem out loud. Her voice shook, her hands trembled, but she read it, and when she finished, the room erupted in gentle applause and tears. I held her afterward, and she said, "It doesn't hurt the same anymore." And I knew exactly what she meant. I eventually moved back to Arrow Rock, not to the old house, but to a small cottage on the edge of town with tall windows and a bright yellow door. I turned the front room into a studio where I painted wildflowers, rivers, and the faces of women who refused to disappear. I baked bread for the local market and taught watercolor classes at the library on Wednesdays. People came to know me not as that girl or that story, but as Grandma Ellie, the woman with the gentle hands and strong voice, the one who remembered everything but wasn't crushed by any of it. Still, there were days when shadows visited. A door creak too sudden, a sermon on the radio, a question from a curious child that made my chest tighten, but I had learned how to breathe through them, to remind myself I was no longer that girl in the attic, no longer the one with no voice, no escape. I was a woman who had clawed her way out of darkness and built a life of color, of truth, of fire, and most importantly, I had survived, not just in body, but in spirit, in voice, in purpose. Now, when young women ask me how I made it through, I don't give them easy answers. I tell them the truth. Healing is not a straight line. Some days, it hurts all over again. Some days, the sky feels too heavy. But every time you speak your truth, no matter how shaky your voice, you take back a little more of your life, and that is how we win. One word at a time, one breath, one truth, one survivor lighting the path for another. Starting over in Arrow Rock wasn't a decision I made lightly. I'd spent years building a new life far away from the echoes of that house, that town, that past. But something inside me, something steady and persistent, kept calling me back. Not to reclaim the place, but to reclaim the parts of myself I had buried there. I no longer needed to hide from the memories. I was ready to stand beside them. The cottage I found sat just outside the town limits, nestled at the end of a gravel road with fields stretching out on both sides. It wasn't much 2 bedrooms, a squeaky porch swing, and linoleum floors that curled at the edges, but it was mine. I painted the front door yellow, filled the kitchen with herbs and hanging mugs, and let the sun fill every room. For the first time in a long time, I felt rooted, not trapped, but grounded. The town had changed some. New faces had moved in. The bakery had become a cafe. The church had a younger pastor now, but some things were just as I remembered: the same cobblestone sidewalks, the same sound of the wind rustling through the sycamores, the same old bell at the schoolhouse. What surprised me most was how people welcomed me. There were whispers at first, of course. Some still remembered what had happened or what they thought had happened, but most were kind, curious, but kind. I was no longer the girl whose grandfather. I was Eloise, the artist, the one who made rosemary bread and painted riverbanks in oil and hosted story nights for children at the library. I started volunteering at the Historical Society, helping catalog old photos and letters. It was there that I met Ruth Caldwell, the new town historian, a woman with a crown of gray curls and a laugh like creek water. We became fast friends. She didn't ask me about my past. She just showed up at my door with rhubarb pie and talked about old buildings and lost recipes. One evening, as we sat on my porch sipping sweet tea, she asked, "Have you ever thought about telling your story out loud, like all the way out?" I blinked. "You mean like a talk?" She nodded. "Not just for survivors, for everyone, women, men, young people, the whole town. Maybe it's time they hear it from you, not from rumors." The thought terrified me. For years, I had spoken in private rooms, to closed circles, behind safe walls. But this would mean stepping into the very community that once failed to protect me and showing them I had not just survived, but thrived. I told her I'd think about it. And I did. For weeks, until one afternoon, I was sorting old letters at the Historical Society and came across a black and white photograph of my grandfather. He stood outside the old chapel, Bible in hand, smiling broadly, his other arm resting on the shoulder of a child. My throat tightened. He was still in their archives, still remembered as a shepherd, a pillar. No one had written about the truth. That night, I wrote my speech. It took me hours, then days to get it right. I didn't want it to be angry, though I had every right. I didn't want to be bitter. I wanted it to be honest, brave, a bridge, not a wall. The day of the town hall meeting, the library auditorium filled up faster than anyone expected. The mayor came, teachers, teenagers, women I had grown up with, even some old men who had once shaken my grandfather's hand every Sunday morning. I stood behind the podium, palms sweaty, heart pounding like it wanted to run without me. And then I began. I told them about the little girl who used to sit in the pew with her hands folded tightly in her lap, about how she wanted to please, to be holy, to be loved. I told them how trust was twisted into control, how silence was enforced through shame. I didn't name every detail I didn't need to. What mattered was the truth. I spoke for 20 minutes. When I finished, the room was quiet, not with judgment, but with reverence. Slowly, people began to stand, applaud. One woman cried. A teenage girl hugged her mother. The mayor shook my hand and thanked me for my courage. After that night, something in Arrow Rock shifted. A month later, the Historical Society created a new exhibit, Truth in the Tapestry, dedicated to the hidden stories of women in the town's past. I was invited to contribute one of my paintings and a typed excerpt from my speech. My portrait was hung not far from my grandfather's, but this time, my story came with it. More importantly, survivors began reaching out, one by one, quietly at first. Women stopped me at the market or on walks. Some shared their own stories. Some simply nodded, eyes shining. One older gentleman, Mr. Hollis, a retired music teacher, took my hand and said, "I wish we had known. I wish I had known. I'm so sorry. Eloise, I forgave him. I forgave a lot of people in those months. Not for them, but for me. Carrying hate is like drinking poison and hoping the other person suffers. I let it go. Not because they deserved peace, but because I did." With Ruth's help, I launched a community program called the Porchlight Project, a safe space where women of all ages could come, share, learn, and support one another. We met every Thursday evening, sometimes to talk, sometimes to paint, sometimes just to sit in silence together. And from that silence, strength grew. One evening, a teenage girl named Lily came to her first meeting. She looked small and nervous, sleeves pulled over her hands, eyes glued to the floor. She didn't speak for 3 weeks. Then, one night, she raised her hand and said, "He said no one would believe me, but you're here, so maybe someone will." I walked across the room and hugged her. "I believe you," I whispered, because sometimes that's all it takes. One voice, one story, one survivor lighting the path for the next. That's what my life had become, not a monument to suffering, but a lighthouse. Years passed. The seasons changed like chapters. My hair turned silver. My hands grew slower. But the fire in my chest never dimmed. And every Sunday, when the children at the farmer's market come running to my booth for bread or cookies or a story, I smile. I kneel down. I listen. I teach them that no voice is too small, no truth too inconvenient. That bravery isn't always loud. It's often a whisper that refuses to stay silent. I still have the journal Mrs. Corwin gave me all those years ago. Its pages are full now, scribbles, poems, names, prayers. But on the last page, I wrote one line in bold, careful ink. He tried to break me. I built something beautiful from the pieces. Some nights, I still sit on my porch long after the sun has disappeared behind the hills of Arrow Rock. The air gets cool, and the crickets start their song, and I rock slowly in that old wooden chair with my hands resting quietly in my lap. I watch the stars blink awake one by one, and I think about the girl I used to be, the one who hid beneath bed sheets, afraid to speak, afraid to breathe too loud. I wish I could reach through time and hold her. I'd tell her she was never dirty, never wrong, that the shame she carried was never hers to bear, that survival isn't about forgetting. It's about living in defiance of the darkness that tried to consume you. I would tell her that healing is not a finish line, but a road you walk slowly, one step, one breath, one truth at a time. I didn't just survive my grandfather. I outlived his cruelty. I turned the silence he forced upon me into a story that now lights the path for others. I became a woman who helps, who listens, who believes. I became someone my younger self would have clung to, like a lifeline. And now, in this quiet corner of Missouri, I am known not for what happened to me, but for what I've done with it. Last fall, I painted a mural on the side of the library, a field of wildflowers blooming from cracked ground, each one different, each one rising toward the light. At the center is a single figure, a girl standing tall, her arms wide open to the sky. Children pass by and point. Some ask who she is. I smile and say, someone who didn't give up, and that's how I hope they'll remember me. Not as a victim, but as a survivor who chose to speak, who chose to stay, who chose to bloom. Life doesn't always offer justice, but it does offer resilience. Sometimes, the ones who hurt us wear the faces most trusted by the world. But truth doesn't vanish. It waits patiently within us, and when we find the courage to speak, it becomes a bridge not just to healing, but to hope for others. If you've been silenced, shamed, or broken, know this: your story matters. Your voice matters. And even in the darkest night, you have the power to become someone's light. You are not alone. You never were. And it's never too late to begin again. If this story touched your heart, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more real, powerful stories like this one. Thank you for being here with all my heart.